Hello, everyone. My name is Frank Guridy, and I'm delighted to be here with the eminent baseball writer, journalist, critic, Howard Bryant. And this is a conversation that we're having for the Pandemic Baseball Club. And we're thinking that since it's 2021 and we're approaching the All-Star break in the Major League Baseball season, that this be a great time to put on our historian hats and think about where the game was 50 years ago during the 1971 Major League Baseball season, particularly with respect to Black and Latino players. It's a really important season in Major League Baseball, and I thought it'd be really delightful to talk about it a bit with Howard Bryant. Howard, how are you today?
I'm good, Frank. How are you? I'm sorry, while you were talking, I was looking up. I wanted to see the actual box score for the 71 All-Star game.
Well, I got it in front of me,
so I hadn't looked at it in a while.
It's some good stuff. Obviously there are many baseball seasons that were pivotal, but I think we're both in agreement that 1971 was particularly important for a variety of reasons. So I thought we could start talking about that, and I really wanted to start talking about one of the big stars of that season. Importantly, essentially the biggest star, certainly in the American League, and that was Vida Blue, the left-handed pitcher who was then 21, going on 22. He wasn't a rookie, but he wound up having a historic season. It was his breakout season. He was 24-8 with a 1.82 ERA, 301 strikeouts. He started the MLB All-Star game, and he helped lead the Oakland Athletics sort of ascend with their first division-winning season. So I want to ask you about what your sense of Vida as obviously one of the historic Black Aces. We're calling the Black Aces project of a couple years back. Mudcat Grant was actually, I think he was on that A's team, at least at the beginning. He was traded, I believe, or he certainly was in the picture there, at least a part of Vida's time in his early years with the A's. So give us your thoughts of Vida that year and just of his career in general.
Yeah, well, Vida's a pivotal figure. He's a really interesting guy as well. In fact, Vida's always, the last time I saw Vida was also the last time I saw Pedro Gomez, the great, great baseball writer. We were all hanging out in January of 2020 in Arizona, A's fantasy camp, and we all went over to the hotel to have a drink afterwards. And so that was the last time I saw Vida, and obviously the last time I saw Pedro. I think that Vida, one of the things about Vida that always made me sort of laugh was growing up, when you're a kid growing up watching him, and also I think it's because of those green and gold uniforms, you just thought he was way bigger than he was. Vida's only 5'10".
That's right.
5'10", 5'10 and a half. He's not a big guy. And so, but when you watch him on the mound, you would think he was 6'3", 6'4", whatever, because he had the big long stride, big left-handed over the top delivery. Then he would go sidearm, but not a big guy. And it's always sort of a reminder about how much the game has shifted in terms of who plays it. Even if, Vida Blue today, even with his arm, is probably maybe not even considered a starting pitcher because he's not big enough. You go look at the Yankees, I think 2016 or 2017, one of those years, the Yankees had, I think, 5 pitchers over 6'6". Mm-hmm. And so it's just a totally different game. But clearly a Blazer. One of my favorite essays from Roger Angel was on Vida's first half of the season. I think he wrote it for the New Yorker in 71. I think it was a pitching matchup between he and Sonny Siebert. They were both leading the league and wins 1-2 in the league. And, it's amazing when we think about these periods, how important baseball was in the culture, that people were circling pitching matchups. And they were circling the last time I remember something like that happening was obviously Gooden 84, Clemens 86, where, even Hershiser's year in 88, where, and obviously, of course, Pedro in 99, Pedro Martinez, where the starting pitcher is just captivating the entire year. That when this guy goes on the mound, it was must see. It was a must see event. And that's how it was with Vida 71. Nobody expected him to do what he did. And also back then, the strikeouts, just the fact whenever you see a left-hander strike guys out, you're immediately thinking Koufax. Mm-hmm. And what he did, especially the first half of the season, you're just looking at him going, wow, what a future.
Yeah, he wasn't a big guy, but he had a big fastball, right?
Yeah.
I mean that's the thing that you see everybody talking about. I've been digging around the archives, and I found this great feature. It's on YouTube by Hale Brune, where they profile him right before the All-Star break, and they interview Bob Lemon, who was then the opposing manager of the Kansas City Royals, and some of his players about their futile efforts to hit his fastball,
Yeah.
right? Because it was that classic fastball that would sail and dart and was really unpredictable, and he had tremendous control, which is what the thing that many people were commenting on at the time throughout his career, but certainly that year.
Yeah, and also Vida at that time, the American League was nowhere near as much of a fastball league as the National League.
That's right.
And so it wasn't that guys couldn't hit a fastball in the American League. It was just that, if you came at them with velocity, that was something that they weren't exactly used to and would become less and less used to. Obviously, when you get a guy like Nolan Ryan coming into the American League, different story. But in general, just the pitching styles were different because the umpire's equipment was different. And so the thing with Vida that I always found interesting too about him as a pitcher, one was the velocity, the type of pitcher he was, because people don't always associate left-handers with big velocity. Mm-hmm. The crafty left-hander, or the get me over fastball left-hander, the guy he's not beating you with pace. Whereas you usually expect that from a right-hander, somebody not named Koufax. You don't get it that often from the left side. I thought it was actually really interesting as well when you think about that period and where the sport was. You're just coming out of '68. You're a couple of years removed from that, where pitchers are dominating the sport anyway. Mm-hmm. You're 2 years removed from the designated hitter in the American League, and it just feels like pitching that the game is getting more and more out of balance. Mm-hmm. And they'd already, lowered the mound, and you could see that the game was starting to move in such a direction that very similarly to where we are now, where people are talking about the game being once again out of balance. And then here comes Vida, who's just bringing absolute velocity on a team that's on the rise as well. I mean, all of the different elements sort of came together.
Yeah, and as you said, when you're talking about the game and the larger culture, I mean, Vida becomes a national celebrity. This is Time Magazine, this is from August '71.
And baseball players on the biggest magazine in the country, the biggest news magazine. Once again, when you think about those time periods, it's just all so different than it is now in terms of this battle for trying to get attention and where you fit in the culture. And also one of the most important things about Vida was his battle with Charlie Finley over labor in terms of him, quitting and essentially working for a plumbing company
the following season.
Right.
Yeah. That's right. No, and in fact, and that's the other thing that was commented on by the press at the time is that, as you noted earlier, he's putting at least 10,000 more butts in the seats in all the games. The A's were not drawing. They never did draw very well in that period. But when Vida, was starting to get hot around May, June, crowds of 23,000, 35,000, which were big crowds for the A's at that time, were turning out. And then, of course, the road games, he's a national sensation. He's putting money in Finley's pockets and in Major League Baseball's pockets for sure.
Yeah, and when you're, and when you're a road draw and when you're the guy people are coming to watch, and there's no doubt that the players feel an even greater injustice because they're looking at their paychecks. And now you see it twice, you see it, okay, on the one hand, you look at the crowd and you go, okay, they're here to see me. Then you look at your paycheck and you're going, it's not being reflected in what I'm being paid. And also during that same period, you're coming off of the Curt Flood decision.
That's right.
So all of this is happening right around the same time. All of these player power empowerment questions are taking place. And the athletes, it's always going to be the athletes who come from the most difficult conditions that are always out front. Vida's from Louisiana and from a tough ass place. And he does it in Oakland, where Curt Flood is from.
That's right.
And all the players are toiling as a team on the rise under Charlie Finley. So you can really begin to feel that there's a sense of revolution and tension in the climate of the game, in the air. So, I mean, I always felt like Vida was a bit of a comet as well, because he was never as good again as he was that year. And when you talk to people, and I think even when you read I think when you read Jason Turbo's book on this, he talks about Vida never quite playing with the same joy, and the game.
He was embittered. He was absolutely embittered.
Yeah, the game turned from a game to a business very, very quickly for a lot of those guys, and they're all in the same boat. Reggie, Catfish, Vida, all of them sort of felt the same bitterness toward the sport because the business end of it hit them in the face so hard.
Yeah. And, and again, Vida, was really young too. That's the other thing. He's 21, 22 years old in that period. I mean, and that year. And so, one of the things that really jumped out at me when Naomi Osaka made her announcement about not skipping press conferences, something I'm going to write about in a piece I'm working on now. One of the we watch Vida's comments to the press. By July, August, he's done. He can't handle the pressure from the press, and he says so. He says, "I'm about to crack. Please don't ask me any more questions." Mm-hmm. That's the period where there's no filter, there's no separation between the writers. Again, overwhelmingly white writers, right, or all white male writers, and a young black athlete like Vida Blue. And so the fame and celebrity aspect of the story is also interesting. The fact that he was very upfront with the fact that he was really tired of just being harassed by the press.
Yeah, and also at that time when the black athlete was expected to be happy about all these things, to be grateful, to be deferential, that we're doing you the favor by talking to you, and you should be grateful for even being allowed to play in the sport. So you'd never really felt a great deal of agency to say no, even though this is the same period as Muhammad Ali. This is 71 as Ali's championship fight, against Frazier. So there are all these different elements swirling around at the same time, but that doesn't mean that the players were absolutely aware. I think one of the things that we get a chance to do for our professions is we get to step back and look at it, but in real time, they're not seeing all of these different dots connecting. They're too busy trying to grind and figure out how they're going to navigate this day and that start and this outing and everything else. That's
exactly right. Yeah. And, I'd love to just spend a little more time talking about him and that generation of black baseball players, right? And again, and I want to talk about the 71 All-Star game, which exemplifies this generational shift that's happening there. And this very well, that with the work you did with your Henry Aaron book, among other things you've done. Vida's on a television show with Willie Mays, a Dick Cavett show, right? And so like Mays is the established national black baseball celebrity, right? And so
20 years.
Right at that point, right? And so so you've got Mays, you've got Aaron, you got people like that, right? Although Aaron doesn't have the same celebrity status that Willie Mays does, right? And so here's this guy from late Jim Crow, Mansfield, Louisiana, right, being thrown into this situation, right? And so to think about how he's navigating that as somebody coming from the Jim Crow South, and being ascending to a level of a Willie Mays, at least that season. But as a black player, as a younger black player, this is an interesting dynamic that we're also seeing in his ascendance that year.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that, and obviously at that level, you're at the top of the top, because as much as Willie Mays was the standard, so was Dick Cavett. I mean, that show, if you were, that's like going on the Tonight Show. If you were on Dick Cavett, everybody saw you, everybody was watching. And I think that this is one of the things that people don't quite understand today, is that back then you didn't have 150 channels. You essentially had 3 channels, and then you had your UHF and you had your PBS. But for the most part, everybody was watching the same thing. Yep. And so the idea of fame in 1971 is nothing like the idea of fame in 2021. There are people today who are famous I've never heard of.
That's right.
I don't even know what they do. And you go look at their Instagram followers, and like one of my friends told me the other day, he's like, each of the Kardashians has at least 200 million followers. I'm like, 1, how do you know that?
Right.
And 2, is that really true? And so I ended up looking it up, and it's true. It's like Kim Kardashian has 271 million Instagram followers. There are only 330 million people in the country. Right. And yet I still don't know what she does. But back then, when you go back and you look at what that type of exposure did for your career, if you were on the Tonight Show, it changed everything. Yeah. Everybody knew who you were. And I think that obviously these things all contribute to Vida as a player saying, I deserve more. I mean, if I'm at the pinnacle of this culture's pop culture peak. I'm here. I'm at the top of this, and I'm making $11,000 a year. And this is where you start getting that revolution. This is where you start fighting. And at that time, what could he do? You're going to hold out for more money. You'll either get more money or you won't get more money, because you can't change teams because you're still in the middle of a reserve clause. You got 4 more years of a reserve clause. You can't do anything. And if you want to get, if Charlie Finley decided to muscle you, which he did, you were either going to play or you weren't playing at all. You couldn't force a trade. There was nothing you could do. And so that level of power and that level of control, especially for somebody who's from the Jim Crow South, who's from, a place that is rooted in control, just added to the frustration and added to the disillusionment.
No question. Yeah. And I think, and in fact, so he holds out the next year after the 71 season, in which he wins the Cy Young and the MVP award, right? The A's win the division. They lose in the ALCS to the Baltimore Orioles. They get swept, but the team is on the rise. They win the World Series the next year.
And the year after, and the year after.
And the year after. But after the holdout, what does he say? He says, Charlie Finley treated me like a colored boy. That's exactly what he says, right? So he understood very clearly what was at stake there. Even though the A's, had significant amounts of Black and Latino players, but Finley was cheap, but Blue understood this as precise in the terms that you're laying out here as somebody of the Jim Crow South was being treated like that. Ironically, so Finley was actually from Birmingham, Alabama himself,
exactly.
right?
This all looks very familiar.
It really did. It really did. Yeah. So in that first half, so I want to get to the All-Star game, which I want to talk about for a little bit. So he loses his first start, and then he wins 10 in a row, right? 10 complete games. I think it's 8 shutouts or 6 shutouts or something like that. The numbers I have somewhere, I don't have them on the top of my head. And then coming to the All-Star break, he's 17-3, and it's clear he's going to be the starting pitcher. And so he's they're getting ready to play the National League, which at this point had started dominating the All-Star game in the 1960s because of integration, because it had an overabundance, but more Black players and Latino players, right, during the 60s, and that domination continues afterwards into the 1980s. And so one of the All-Stars in the National League team is Doc Ellis, who people know very well about, the starting pitcher, there's a great documentary about him, many things written about Doc Ellis. And he says a couple of weeks before the game, there's no way they're going to allow 2 brothers to start the All-Star game. But sure enough, Sparky Anderson picks him to start the All-Star game. Sparky Anderson, the National League manager, right? Earl Weaver was the American League manager. And so sure enough, you got 2 Black pitchers, the only time that 2 Black pitchers faced off started in the All-Star game. So tell us, give me a sense of what you think about that, and also just about the game itself.
I think the biggest thing about that game, is the rosters.
Yes. I
mean, you look at those rosters, and the game is completely unrecognizable, especially in terms of the complexions of the players who are playing. It's unrecognizable from what it is today. You look at them, you've got Mays, Aaron, Stargell, Bench. You got 4 Hall of Famers on the National League right there. And you've got Aparicio, Brooks Robinson, Frank Robinson, Yastrzemski, and Carew. You got 5 Hall of Famers on that side. I mean, so that doesn't even include the bench. You've got all kinds of star power. It's everywhere.
I think it's 20 everywhere. Hall of Famers were in that game. 20
What's
Hall
that?
of Famers. It's 20. It's like 20
well, exactly. You're looking at the
game.
whole thing. You got Tom Seaver and Marichal and Fergie Jenkins, Steve Carlton, Clemente. Clemente wasn't even a starter.
I know.
And it's just, it really is sort of amazing the number of people. And then, of course, never mind the near misses. You got the guys who aren't in the Hall of Fame who are pretty damn good as well. It's just, Vida being one of them.
That's right. Tony Oliva was supposed to play and he got hurt. And in fact, who replaced Tony Oliva on that roster? Reggie Jackson.
It was Reggie. Yep.
So here's another figure who's not even in that, he's not on that team.
Yeah, Reggie didn't even start, and Reggie's the star of that All-Star game.
That's right.
And so, and he hits the transformer and, one of the biggest home runs longest home runs. And of course, Doc Ellis vowed to get Reggie back for that stare down and everything else. And he did get him back eventually by throwing at him. But it's a throwback whenever I think about All-Star games, and especially that one. And I never saw that when I was 3 years old. I never saw it. I was 2 years old. And so, however, the power of the All-Star game was so apparent because of moments like this, games you never even saw, and because of the technology, what the technology today has done to the All-Star game, these games take on an even greater significance.
That's right.
The All-Star games don't matter today because we have so many channels and you have interleague play. It doesn't matter. You know, I mean, for us growing up, the All-Star game was huge because you got to see the other league.
Huge.
You know, I don't know, where did you grow up? Are you in New York?
New York City, yeah. So I saw I had the Yankees and the Mets.
Two-team market. I didn't, and I grew up in Boston. We never saw the National League.
Right.
So the National League in the game of the week. So the Mike Schmidts and the Willie Stargels and the Steve Carltons, we never saw those guys. We saw them Saturday afternoons, maybe, right? You saw them at the All-Star game, you saw them in the World Series. That's it. And periodically, when they broadcast a few Red Sox games in spring training against National League teams, you get to see a couple of those guys then. So the All-Star game was a really, really big deal. It was a big deal in terms of marketing. It was a big deal in terms of must see, because if you don't see these guys, they're not all going to the World Series. So you're not going to see any of them until next year. And so it's really something. And then from a nostalgia historical standpoint as well, just looking at those names, it's always good to hop on YouTube and go watch that game periodically, or how much of that game you get to see. Tiger Stadium, obviously. I had the pleasure of covering games in Tiger Stadium before it shut down from, the first couple of years on the beat. And so, before Comerica. And so it really is, I think sometimes when you think about these moments, you realize what's been, I don't know if lost is the right word, but just how baseball has shifted, how much the game, its place in the society has shifted so much.
Totally. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it was must see TV. And, and when you watch the game on YouTube, as I've watched many times, because I'm a historian and that's what I do, you see these big names do tremendous things, right? So Henry Aaron had never hit an extra base hit in an All-Star game until that game when he takes Vida deep in the third inning. He hits an opposite field home run. Johnny Bench takes him deep as well. So he gives up 2 hits. He hits Willie Stargell. He gives up 2 hits and 2 home runs. The wind was blowing out to right field, so all the balls were being carried out. Clemente takes Mickey Lowler's deep in the 8th inning to right center field, upper deck. And then, of course, there's Reggie's homer. And then the other homer that's hit by Frank Robinson, right? I mean, so you've got this, you've got these established stars like Robinson, like Mays. Mays doesn't do anything in this game, but he's there. He's the starting center fielder. That's his last All-Star game.
That's Mays' hurrah. That's his last.
That's his hurrah. He's in the next 2 All-Star games, but that's his last.
Well, no, I mean, the 71 was his last great season, his last really good season.
That's right.
And that was, the last time, the Giants were in the playoffs, because then he goes to the Mets, and then that's that.
That's right.
But, you've got Mays leading off. You've got Mays and Aaron hitting back to back, which is also sort of amazing. And it's from, once again, not just a nostalgia, but a history standpoint. You look at that. I mean, that game is almost a documentary unto itself.
Somebody should make it, and they should have us on there talking about it.
You should make it.
I would love to. Yeah, no, it's great. It's great theater, right? And then the other thing about that game, again, looking at it, now All-Star pitchers pitch maybe 1 inning at the most, right? The NL pitchers that day was Doc Ellis started, right? He loses the game. He gives a homer to Reggie, and then he gives up another one to Frank Robinson in the 3rd inning. After him is Wymati Shao, Dominican legend for the Giants. Then Ferguson Jenkins, who gives up a 2-run homer to Harmon Killebrew, and that's the game winner. And then finishing up for him is Don Wilson, a really interesting figure who dies tragically 5 years later. So all the pitchers of the National League were none of them were white, which is interesting. And then for the American League is Vida Blue, Jim Palmer, and Mike Cuellar, fellow ace for the Orioles, and then Lolich finishes the game. So like these people are pitching 2-3 innings. And so you're seeing, a lot of these players playing deep in the bench. He might catch the whole game, or they played deep into those games.
Yeah, exactly. That's true. And it's also interesting as well when you think about the number of Black players and Latino pitchers That's also the year of 71 is September 71 is the year when the Pirates had the first all black and Latino lineup, coming up 2 months after that. Right. And so the diversity in the game, the statistics in the game, everything is shifting, and it's reflective in the players. It's reflective in the lineups. And it's interesting because when you think about where we are today, when everybody's always lamenting where black players are in the sport and everything else, these are the years also when baseball as an industry is making the beginning inroads into Latin America in terms of their academies, in terms of their infrastructure, in terms of their investment. So watching this game, you can start to see it's the beginning of the shift from black players in the game to Latino players in the game.
Yeah, that's right. And actually the team that exemplifies that very well is that 71 Pirates team, the Pirates themselves, 100%. Right? Bruce Markinson wrote about this in his book, right? Because the Pirates have African-American players from the United States, Puerto Rican players like Clemente and Jose Pagan. They got these cats from Panama, Manny Sanguillen, right? Rennie Stennett is I think that's his first or second year with the Pirates. Jacinto Jackie Hernandez is a Cuban shortstop. So, you're seeing a whole array of the African diaspora of the Americas in baseball on that team, which makes them really fascinating. Of course, Stargell, is a legend on that team, and Clemente has his epic performance in the 71 series that year.
That's right. That's right. And so all of it, and that's why it's important to go back to some of these moments, and you can see how things shifted, and you can see what that actually looked like cosmetically. And you go 10 years later, it doesn't quite look different. You go 20 years later, it's night and day.
Yeah.
And you go 30 years later to now, never mind 40 or 50 years later, it's a totally different sport. And all of those changes were taking place right around this time.
That's right. Yeah, and it's the ascendancy of the kind of transformations ushered in by the integration era, the transformation that you described already in terms of labor, right, which was right around the corner, or right happening at that time with Curt Flood, and then the end of the reserve clause in the mid 70s, and then the demographic transformation, and yet that game stands out. Like 16 of the 39 National League All-Stars are Black or Latino. Think about that, right? There's so many things about that game that stand out. Again, like with Doc Ellis and Vida being the starters, right? I mean, so on the one hand, it's part of this trajectory of change you can see afterwards, and building up beforehand. But on the other hand, it also stands out as an event in and of itself.
No question.
Part of it because of the transcendent performances. I mean, it's a fun game to watch. I mean, I like watching old games like that, and this is, I think, why I was born in 71. As absurd as it sounds, but as a kid in the Bronx who played baseball, to me, baseball was a black and Latin sport. It was a Latino sport. That's how I understood it, because by the time
it still is up there. If you're in the Bronx,
absolutely.
Go hang out on those fields over by Yankee Stadium and see.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And that was my experience playing the game growing up in New York. In the late 70s, early 80s, and so by the early 80s, you've got at that point you've got you got Winfield, you got Dave Parker, you got a whole other array of pitchers. Vida's still around. His last All-Star game was 1981 with the Giants. And he doesn't have the breakout, the kind of the same level on the statistics, but he's a perennial All-Star. He actually pitches and starts 3 All-Star games. 78, and then the 75 game, and then the 78 game, and then of course the A's win 3 consecutive World Championships and 5 division titles.
No, Vida Blue is a borderline Hall of Famer. I mean, and that is the hard part with him, is that borderline piece really started with that holdout. And he had a much better career than people give him credit for. We remember the one year, and then of course he bounced around. Then he leaves the A's, he goes to the Royals, he goes to the Giants. He's not exactly a journeyman, but he's not a headliner anymore either. Right. But that didn't mean he wasn't a good pitcher. He was still very much a top line guy.
No doubt. And who's the National League Cy Young Award winner that year? Mr. Ferguson Jenkins, right? Ferguson Jenkins, that's his Cy Young, and I think it's the middle of his 7 straight 20-win seasons. Yep. He's another figure that's extremely important in that period, right? As a black pitcher.
Well, and it goes back to what a lot of the black players were saying back then when you're talking about the Dominican influence and the investment that teams were making in those academies. Essentially 10 years, 12 years, 15 years earlier, you still had the Negro Leagues being an interesting and important part of where talent came from, at least 20 years earlier, no question. You still had, Black athletes being sought out as baseball players and developed as baseball players. All of that begins to go away once you get into the 65 draft as well. By the time you get to 71, you see the demographics, and you have a lot of Black players at the time saying, well, they replaced us with them.
That's right.
And it is going away when you're starting to look and see who's being signed and who's playing. It's especially true when you think about Black pitchers, when you think about the Doc Ellises and the J.R. Richards and the Fergie Jenkinses and Lynn McLaughlin's and all of those guys. And you realize that there was a period in time where the Black pitcher was becoming less and less of a curiosity. And then they became a curiosity again as soon as they got replaced by Latino pitchers. And you go back and think about this, both from a pitching standpoint, but especially from a catching standpoint. You haven't had a Black catcher, a Black regular everyday catcher in the big league since 2005.
Is it Charles Johnson?
Charlie Johnson, exactly. Johnson? You got to go back 16 years before you had an everyday Black catcher. Yeah. And so they replaced them with us thing that the Black players have said, it's a battery question as well, because if you're going to develop Latino pitchers, because that's essentially where your farm ground is now, then you need Latino catchers to communicate with them. Right. So they can actually control the game. Yeah. So they can communicate about what pitchers are going to throw and how they're going to control the sport, how they're going to control an individual game. And so that being the case, the economics of the sport actually changed who got to play. And so you did have some Black catchers. You never had a huge number, Earl Beatty, you had, Elston Howard, you had a few Black catchers. You never, Johnny Roseborough, a big number, but you certainly had more then, but there were more Black catchers between 1947 and 1970 than there's been 1970 since.
That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. And as you say, I mean, this is tied up into the economics of the game and how labor is recruited, right?
And who gets to play.
And who gets to play, and even in that period, you're right. I mean, it's true. Like Black pitchers were a curiosity, and they were becoming less so. But like you see clearly the way integration worked. There was outfielders, other positions, and pitching and catching was sort of like the NFL quarterback position, right? Which it was still. And in fact, why did I decide to become a pitcher? If I be autobiographical for a second, it's because my dad took me to Shea Stadium for the first time in 1979 on a weeknight in April. The Mets, who were terrible under Joe Torre, the manager, were playing the San Francisco Giants, and who was on the mound for the Giants? Vida Blue. And immediately I was like, Dad, who's this guy? Who's this guy with the high socks, this Black dude on the mound? And ironically, the Mets beat him. They shelled him that night for some reason. He didn't have a good night that night, but I was compelled because I wanted to pitch because I saw Vida Blue on the mound pitching for the Giants that year.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And when that stuff happens, there is a domino effect. I mean, these things don't happen out of the blue, and they don't happen for nothing. And that's one of the things that has always bothered me about this conversation, where people just blame the Black kids. Yeah. Oh, well, they'd rather play football and they just don't want to play baseball anymore. Yeah. No, there's an economic machine that is driving the sport away from you. And that's been the case for 50 years. And so now what you're seeing is a realization of that vision. Obviously, there are Black players who have always believed that the sport didn't want them. And then there are going to be the white executives in the game who might refer to it as an unintended consequence. But the end result is the same.
Yes.
The complexion of the sport, the people who get to play the sport, very, very different today than it was in 1971.
No, that's exactly right. Exactly right. Well, one more point on the 71 season. I know Wimbledon's happening and some of us are still interested in that. I think both of us are. The Pirates team wins the World Championship. It's one of my favorite World Series, the 1971 series, for so many reasons. It's just great performances. That Orioles team, That's the team of Frank Robinson, Brooke Robinson, and that team that comes together in 1966 when the Reds stupidly trade Frank Robinson to the Orioles, right? They win the World Series that year, and then in 69 they lose to the Mets. They win the pennant in 70. Everybody expects them to beat the Pirates in 71, and because of Roberto Clemente's transcendent performance along with Steve Blass, the Pirates, pull out a really exciting,
they come back from 3-1.
They come back. No, I think they were down 2-0. They were down 2-0. They came back with 3-1.
3-1 is 79.
79 with the We Are Family team. They were 2-0. They got shelled. They got, Doc Ellis gets bombed in the first game. They lose like 10-1 in the second game.
Yep.
Nobody thinks they're going to win, and they somehow come back and win. Steve Blass has his moment winning game 3 and game 7. Then Clemente gets 13 hits, timely hitting the throws. I mean, it's a performance that literally brings me to tears because it's just extraordinary to watch.
Amazing, for what he did, and also, the poignancy of that because of what happened next.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. And I mean, talk about what could have been, I mean, goodness, on the field for him and then off, he was, as Moranis and the documentary showed a couple years back, he was on his way to become a statesman. I mean, he was somebody who, was going to be impactful, for a long time after, and it's just a tragic.
Very streaky series. The Pirates they lost the first 2 and then won the next 3.
They won the next 3. The Orioles barely win game 6 in 10 innings. Frank Robinson, wins the game with his legs. He scores on a sacrifice fly. And then the Orioles, the Pirates win game 7. Blast beats Cuellar 2-1. Clemente hits a homer. Jose Pagan drives in Willie Starr to win a double. And it's a great series. And it's frustrating for the Orioles because everybody thought they were going to win, right? They had won 100 games again that year, and the Pirates pulled it out.
Well, and that's one of the hard things about that sport. And you go back, and we always make these lists of who should have won more, and those Orioles teams are always on that list. 69 they get surprised. 70 they win. 71 they were a good team. 71, that was the year they had 4 20-game winners.
Yes.
Right? Or was that 70? I think it was.
No, it's 71. It's
71.
Cuellar, Palmer, McNally, and the head Pat Dobson.
That's right. And the interesting part of that team and of those matches, those matchups were so stark in how they were played because of Earl Weaver's style and obviously the type of player that Clemente is. And when you watch a player like Clemente, I was actually writing about this the other day for during my Rickey Henderson book I'm working on, talking about when the A's acquired Ruben Sierra, who was a Clemente, disciple in his own way. And that Clemente really shaped the type of player that Ruben Sierra wanted to be. And then the minute Sierra was traded to Oakland for Jose Canseco, Sierra decides he needs to be Jose Canseco. So he bulks up. He's a man mountain now. He can't run. He's not a great thrower anymore. He becomes this one-dimensional slugger when he was a really beautiful player in the 80s.
Yes, he was.
I mean, Ruben Sierra was that guy. He was the epitome of the 5-tool guy, 5-tool switch hitter. And then he became a slugger
hitter. Yeah. Yeah.
A mistake hitter as well, because he was a high average guy before that.
Yep. That's right.
I think I'll just hit exactly. I'll hit mistakes 40 times a year.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah. That's a whole other conversation about, that period. I'd love to just ask you just one more before we go. Put Rickey Henderson in this story, right? It's particularly with respect to race and labor, right? He comes from Oakland, right? So he's later, right? So he's drafted. When did the A's draft him? 75, 76? 76, right?
Fourth round.
And Mike Norris is drafted when? The pitcher.
Norris was drafted before that.
Before that, right? So I mean, the thing about Finley, he was cheap, but he knew how to find talent. He did.
Those guys knew what they were looking at, and especially in the Bay Area, you had such enormous talent anyway. And I think one of the things about that sport, and especially when you compare it and contrast it to today, there's so many examples where the style of the sport just changed dramatically. The type of game that Rickey was entering is not the type of game that players enter today.
Yeah.
There is no question that Rickey is a disciple of that speed game, of that black game, of that base to base, really putting sort of real physical pressure on each in each inning, instead of getting to first, hanging out, waiting to see what's going to happen with the next guy. It's like, no, we're going to force the action here. And it's funny because the type of player that Rickey ended up being, he would never be allowed to be that player today.
I know. It drives me nuts.
And I remember talking to Billy Bean about this when I was working on the research, and Billy said something like, well, Rickey would still be a great player today. He would just be closer to Trout, and he would probably be a 3-hitter. I said, so in other words, you would take the greatest leadoff hitter of all time, the greatest base stealer of all time, and turn them into just another 3-hitter who has some speed that you use, whose speed you use periodically. You would actually have a worse player today. Rickey would be a worse player than he was then, even if the numbers were somewhat similar, because you'd be taking the stolen bases out of it. But Rickey didn't have enough power that he was a 500 home run guy. He would be a 335 to 400 home run guy without all those steals and without all that impact. So he would be a high on base guy, but he wouldn't even be a leadoff guy. So it's just really sort of interesting that when he came along, there was still enough remnant of the old game that he was allowed to enter where his skill set was still respected by enough people in the game, by the Billy Martins of the world and by the Charlie Finleys of the world and all these other folks who sort of recognized that speed was really important.
Yeah, and he's the greatest of that period. But you've got Reigns, you've got other folks, too. Those players for the Cardinals. Willie Wilson, right? I mean, the Royals.
Yeah, Willie Wilson was the target at first when Rickey got there, because he was the standard for base stealing in the American League when Rickey first got in the league. What I find staggering about Rickey, just as a competitor, is that for all the Rickeyisms and everything else that people say, he just demolished the competition.
He did.
Rickey Henderson's got 600 more stolen bases than Tim Raines. And anybody who remembers that period knows that's an impossible number. That can't be, because they were considered side by side.
That's right.
There was Rickey in the American League and there was Raines in the National League.
Yep.
And there were a lot of people who believed Tim Raines might have been a better player.
Yep.
And then when you go back and look,
it's not even close.
There's no contest. Yep. Rickey's got he's got 650 more stolen bases than Vince Coleman.
Yeah.
And Vince Coleman, at the time, his first 4 years, had more stolen bases than Rickey did his first 4 years. I mean, Vince Coleman was a beast.
He was. And
so it really, in a lot of ways, you just go back and you're happy that that the guys came along the way they did, knowing where the game was going to end up.
Yeah.
Because you're just looking at it's a really special time in the sport, and it doesn't even really get the type of respect that it deserves. You look at the number of Hall of Famers from the 70s and the 80s, very, very different than the number of Hall of Famers from the 40s and 50s and the 90s and the 2000s.
That's exactly right. We didn't even talk about Joe Morgan, who wasn't in that 71 All-Star game, but he's very much part of this period too.
Oh, that's right.
I mean,
and he's on his way. Next year, he ends up in Cincinnati.
On the Reds. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly right.
Yep.
Howard, I could talk to you about this stuff all day long.
No, it's my pleasure.
Let's do it again.
My pleasure.
We got to make this 71 All-Star game documentary happen. I'd love to figure that out.
You know what? Maybe that's the next project for this new gig, right? Let's think about that.
It's definitely worth. It's a story. It's one. I mean, people focus on 70 because of Pete Rose. That's another great game, no doubt.
Yep.
But in terms of looking at these dynamics,
yep,
the 71 All-Star game stands out for a lot of reasons.
100%.
Well, I look forward to talking to you again. I cannot wait for the Rickey book to come out. I'm definitely going to find a way to talk to you about that in some way, shape, or form. Thanks, Howard. I appreciate your time.
You got it, man. Call anytime.
Okay, take care.
I'll see ya.